Professor Gardner, I would like to start right at the beginning and ask you, when were you born?
I was born on the 30th of May, 1924.
And that leads me into something that we're interested in about your family, particularly were you born into a medical family?
Yes, I was born in London, where my father had settled, and if I may briefly tell you about his background, his family came from Govan, and his own father and grandfather left the country in the 1880s, I'm fairly certain, to join the gold rush in South Africa. So he was left with his mother and cousins in poor circumstances. His father had been a builder, but he then had to face the prospect of maintaining the family, and to cut a long story short, he was befriended by the Reverend John Lindsay, the minister in Bathgate, where they had moved from Govan, attended the Bathgate High School, later to be named the Lindsay High School, saved enough money by working in the pits as a miner, entered the Edinburgh Medical School at the early years of the century, around 1900, and graduated at the age of 28 in 1908. After that, he moved south, like so many, settled in London, was employed at the Chelsea Women's Hospital, and then Bethnal Green, where he met a nurse whom he married. Shall I continue? The story, sadly, did not end there, because he was taken into what we would call a general practice in Fulham to make money, one presumes. These were the days of the primitive Lloyd George health scheme. And then the war came, and in 1916 he was conscripted, taken into the RAMC, and very quickly, perhaps because of friends at the London School of Hygiene, he sailed with the army to what we would call the Ice Cream War, the German East African campaign, which ran from 1914 right through to 1918. Now, there is a whole story there which we could talk about, but the essential part is that he kept a diary, and this diary, of which I have a copy, and which the Wellcome Trust Library in London also have a copy, is a 60,000-word document detailing his 2 years in what was German East Africa. Now, to answer your original question, we now come to the critical point, because he had dysentery twice. He was working with the troops in what would now be called Somalia, I suppose, and because of his health, or shall we say in spite of his health, he had worked for the Ross Malaria Commission and took part in a report that they published after the war ended. But then his own health interrupted his service, and he was taken back to this country at the very moment that both Africa and Europe were being hit by the influenza pandemic. His wife, who he had married in 1915 before going to the army, died in the epidemic. Then the story changed again, because within a matter of months he met her cousin, whose name was Marjorie, and Marjorie, it turned out, was to be my mother. And at last I come to the answer to your question. Having been, as it were, thought of perhaps in an earlier existence I was conceived and born in London for the reasons that I've explained. Does that...
Yes.
That is the background.
Right. A fascinating background it is, too.
Is that unusual? Yes.
Now, how about school? Did you go to school first in London then?
Well, would you like me, as it were, to carry through
Yes.
sort of chronological events? Yes. My father, like so many Scots, determined that the best way to make a living was to keep going south, and he moved from London after his marriage, his second marriage, and joined a general practice in Brighton on the south coast. He went into partnership with a Dr. Thomas Morgan. My father's name was Thomas also. And my brother Colin was born in Brighton 2 years later, 1926. By that time, my father had decided that he should acquire the whole practice. He'd made sufficient money to take over the entire practice, and within a few years his practice had grown, and he moved from the beautiful central part of Brighton, where he lived in a house opposite the Prince Regent's Indian Pavilion, designed and built by Nash around 1812. He moved from there to a part nearer the centre of the practice. The pavilion played an important part in our lives because our rooms, our bedrooms, faced across Pavilion Parade, and we saw the pavilion in all its splendour. Incidentally, you will probably know that during the First World War, the pavilion, designed to be a replica of a Maharaja's palace, was actually used to house the wounded Indian troops. But later, when peace came, it was employed for all kinds of purposes like operettas, musicals, exhibitions, and so on. At the turn of the decade, 1928-29, my life was nearly brought to an end, not for the first time, because I developed mastoiditis, inflammation of both ears following what must have been a cold. It was only months before Alexander Fleming made his pioneering discovery of penicillin at St Mary's Hospital. But of course it was many years before penicillin became, or any other chemotherapeutic agent became available for treatment. So I had bilateral mastoiditis in the days before chemotherapy. An operation was essential, and my father called on the services of a Mr. Crowe, who was the consultant ear, nose and throat surgeon to the Royal Sussex County Hospital. Now, Crowe was the most interesting man, and I'll tell you a little about him in a moment. But to answer your question, it was soon after that, a year or two after that, after I'd recovered from this debilitating illness, that I went to my first, what you would call a primary school, called St Wilfrid's. It was in the centre of Brighton, at Dyke Road, and was an agreeable, simple primary school. Mr. Crowe, or perhaps even before Mr. Crowe, my father had worked very hard against his impecunious background, and even while he was working in the Chelsea Women's Hospital, he had put together enough material for an Edinburgh University MD, which he submitted in 1910, successfully, fortunately. And then after the First World War was over and he had remarried, he clearly felt the need for further qualifications, and he sat the examinations for fellowship at the Royal College of Surgeons of Edinburgh, unsuccessfully. The reason he was unsuccessful was, as he explained to me when I became a student myself, always read the examination questions carefully. And he had been asked to describe the operation of ovariotomy, instead of which he described the operation of ovariectomy. He failed. He then resat and passed with distinction in 1924, shortly before I was born. In fact, he was awarded a prize, which is a set of instruments engraved with his name, and these are now in the possession of my elder son, Ian, who is a consultant ophthalmic surgeon in Derby. Back to Mr. Crowe, who operated, fortunately, with skill and success on my ears in 1928 or so. He was a man of artistic temperament, and in the years before the Second World War, he had built himself a beautiful modern Picasso-like house on the outskirts of Brighton. When the war came, he was so disturbed that he took his own life. The concept of a war to him was so contrary to his whole temperament that he committed suicide. After 2 or 3 years at the primary school, my father quite wisely looked across the road to a much larger secondary school called Brighton Grammar School. It was founded in the Victorian era, it's well established, a large school, beautiful red brick buildings, large playing fields, and he, by chance, or perhaps this was not chance, had in his practice, or under his care, a number of the masters and their wives. He cared for the masters and delivered the masters' wives of their children, and consequently was very close to the staff of the school. And this may have been a factor in his choice of the school for his sons. But as the years went by, we were, I suppose, well educated in most of the standard subjects. We were taken first into the Cubs, then into the Boy Scouts. We played games, ran races, and then, if I continue with this story for a moment, by 1936-37, my father, who was, as I've told you, a native-born Scot, was convinced, rightly or wrongly, that Scottish education was better than any other. And so, setting Brighton Grammar School on one side, he looked northwards again, took appropriate advice, and settled on a school which you've heard of called Loretto in Musselburgh. This meant that I had to take essential entrance examinations. The problem was that the subjects taught at Brighton Grammar School did not coincide with the subjects examined in these tests. I failed miserably. I was asked about the journeys of St. Paul, for example, whereas I had been studying most of the Old Testament. I was asked some Latin, which I knew nothing, but the headmaster of Loretto School at that time was a man of, rather like Winston Churchill's headmaster. He overlooked the fact that Winston Churchill filled blank pages in his entrance exam, and I was allowed in, and that moves us on to another era. And much happened in the intervening years, of course.
It's a fascinating story. We could develop further in that time, but I would like to ask you about your school in relation to medicine. Was it while you were at school that you thought of doing medicine yourself, or was that pretty well determined because of your family history already, do you think, even as a boy?
There was no conscious decision. It seemed natural and instinctive. I should perhaps add that my wife trained as a nurse in the Edinburgh Royal Infirmary. My daughter trained as a nurse in the eye department of the infirmary. My mother's uncle, born and bred in London, was a graduate of Guy's Hospital, and another cousin was also he was a Middlesex Hospital graduate. So it's a very strong medical element, which is so common, isn't it?
So I think we don't need to discuss where the idea came from.
What happened?
But I'd like to ask about this, Loretta's attitude to your choice of medicine. I mean, was that regarded as something they encouraged, or did medicine, where did it come in the kind of hierarchy of Loretta's ambitions for pupils?
Before I answer that, could I ask you, I'm interrupting, I realise, but will you ask me to talk about extracurricular activities, holidays, visits, travels? That's something separate, because there were important parts that I should refer to. To answer your question about Loretto, the headmaster, J.R.C. Greenlees, was a medical practitioner who had specialised in paediatrics in Glasgow. He happened also to be a rugby forward who played and captained the Scottish team, but his interest in medicine was obvious. He'd been awarded the DSO in the First World War while serving as a medical officer. He was a very distinguished man. So when it came to the bit, if I move forwards now from 1937, when I went to Loretto, to 1940-41, when I was considering what to do next, the war, of course, had started, and in the course of time I'd perhaps like to tell you a little about the impact of the war, which was very great. But Greenlees had himself been a Cambridge graduate before he returned to Glasgow, and his advice to my father was that however meritorious Scottish education was, a first period in Cambridge would be helpful. My father, of course, needed persuasion, and so he took the advice of Dr. Frederick Price, whose textbook you'll be familiar with historically. Price, incidentally, at that time, was an applicant for the chair of medicine in Edinburgh, which came to be occupied by Stanley Davidson. So, with Price's advice in the background, Greenlees' interest in Cambridge, I was entered for Clare College, Cambridge, took more entrance examinations, and moved back south, as it were, in 1942, with the war, of course, at its height.
Right, well, I'd like to almost backtrack a little bit and ask you about other things. First of all, these other interests and other things that contributed to your childhood and growing up, apart from school. What are other influences that you remember as being important?
Yes, there were other influences. Obviously, I've made it clear to you that personal illness was a factor. I survived the mastoiditis. Then a curious episode occurred, which is relevant. In 1931 or so, I developed rheumatic fever. But my father, as I've told you, was a busy general practitioner in Brighton, and occasionally he would invite a consultant from London to go down to the south coast to give a second opinion. He tended to go for people like Sir Thomas Horder, who was, of course, a royal physician. And on one occasion, I was at the height of my rheumatic fever when the King's physician arrived. The patient was brought in to see me, and very wisely recommended the continued use of aspirin in treatment. And so I had the distinction of being seen by the physician to the king. It's a funny little anecdote. Now, the point about this also is that later, round about 1943 or 4, during the war, Thomas Horder was brought down to Brighton again to see another patient. Food rationing was evident. The charge for a consultant coming from London was £1 a mile. Food rationing determined that he brought his own sugar rationing with him, and at breakfast in the morning he'd come early, he reached into his waistcoat pocket and brought out his own lumps of sugar. Curious little stories that one remembers. Going on to, or going back if you like, to what we were saying about schools, you asked me the influence that Greenleeds particularly had on the choice of medicine. It's obvious that he himself was an experienced paediatric practitioner, so that was a natural choice for him. The school was not particularly well placed in the educational field at that time because, as we all know, as the war progressed, more and more of the experienced, capable teachers were conscripted into the armed forces. Many of them, of course, did not come back. I was fortunate in having sufficient physics, chemistry, biology to pass the entrance exams, but organic chemistry was not so easy, and I had to go back to Cambridge to sit that examination before I could get into the college.
You indicated earlier that there were other interests that you had of your own outside school that you think that you occupied you at this time.
I think we all have individual interests. Around about 1936, I'd been given 37. I'd been given £5 by a generous uncle, I think, and I was interested, as we all were, in a certain gentleman called Winston Churchill. And he had just published his 4-volume Life of Marlborough, which I went off and bought. And I picked up a very, very early and strong interest in the life of Winston Churchill, but also in the wars of the early 18th century and the life of Marlborough. Now that paid a little dividend later because, purely by chance, Loretto School had an occasional essay examination in history, and the subject of the Marlborough Wars was set, and I was fortunate enough to do well in the net competition. But that was entirely fortuitous. So interested in history, and of course in turn medical and surgical history was something that has existed most of my life.
Just before sort of leaving the childhood and your early infancies, we take it therefore that you didn't at any time feel pressurized by your family towards medicine. I mean, you were more than willing to go in that direction. It wasn't a source of family conflict or anything.
No, there was no such conflict. I think one could say that my father, as you might have surmised, was not so much authoritarian, but very Scottish in his approach. And I don't know whether I mentioned, but for example, he was canny, generous and thrifty, but not mean. And for his own uses, he kept his bank account not in Brighton, which would have been dangerous because that's where people might learn about it, but in the Bishopsgate office of the Bank of Scotland in London. Once a month he wrote to them and said, "Will you please send me the cash that I need for the next month?" And by return came a registered envelope containing £5. And that was his monthly cash usage at that time. So he's cautious, and as far as we were concerned, when I went to University of Cambridge first, he handed me £10 and said, that's the money for the term. There was never any question of any more being requested or given, and £10 was the term's allowance to cover lunches, entertainment, books, casual expenses, and so on. So you get the impression of somebody who was very careful, very cautious, thrifty, but kindly.
Could we move on to Cambridge now? How did that appeal to you? Your years at Cambridge, did you enjoy them?
It was a new form of life. Now, if I could refer to the war at this point, it's very important. I have been researching material for an autobiography which I'm writing myself at present, so some of these facts I've been checking. If I could just go back to the school for a moment, in May 1940, Anthony Eden described the formation of a new defence organisation called the Local Defence Volunteers, which became the Home Guard. As a result, anyone over the age of 16, which meant many schoolboys, was taken at once into the Home Guard, in addition to the school cadet force. In the following year, 1941, the Air Training Corps was so named, and I moved myself at school from the Army Cadet Force to the Air Training Corps, became a flight sergeant, and learned to, I certainly flew in Beaufighters and other planes, Tiger Moths, and by that time we had trained at Hunter's Bog in Edinburgh, firing American rifles. We fired Tommy guns, and at Drem Aerodrome in East Lothian we learnt how to throw hand grenades and to fire Vickers machine guns. These are all incidental parts of the background to an education. Now, when I got to Cambridge, of course, the war was still, 1942, it was at its height, as I've said. Every night, Lancaster bombers flew overhead. We, as students, manned the fire pumps. 3 or 4 of us were rather lucky because we were able to get the position of college fire crew. This meant that I had the privilege of driving an Essex Terraplane car pulling a fire pump. And of course, at the age of, I suppose, 18, having a car of one's own, effectively, even if it had a fire pump behind it, could be quite good fun. There was one day, of course, when the brakes failed and we ran into a lorry carrying sacks of potato, but nobody said anything. And the fire practice was part of it. It meant, of course, that at Christmas time you might have to spend Christmas in the college rather than going home, because you were on duty to defend the college against aerial incendiary attacks. So the college was, therefore, the background was, and one more point which I think is quite important as indicating the relationship between the war and one's outlook. In 1941, May the 24th, at 6:30 in the morning, the battleship Bismarck and Prince Eugen, the cruiser, confronted the home fleet, the Prince of Wales and HMS Hood, and within a very short time the Hood was struck by a shell and blew up. This was a national disaster, and I remember vividly, I was in Cambridge sitting a preliminary exam, as I've explained. I walked along a street called Petty Curie, and I saw a placard, Hood sunk. And this was a national disaster, because HMS Hood was the best known and best loved ship in the Royal Navy. All the crew were lost, save 6. Among the crew was the younger music teacher that I had had at school. And this was a personal loss to me, which I felt very much. But it was a very good example of how the war struck home. The college otherwise was, for medical students, it was a vigorous, hard-working place, because unlike students of economics or perhaps languages, medical students had lectures from 9 to 1, practical classes from 2 to 4, tutorials, and it was a very intense time because the 3-year initial degree course had been compressed to 2 years. But that, in a sense, did no harm. We simply got on more quickly, I think. And I was very fortunate because at the end of 2 years I was allowed to stay for a 3rd year and take the what is called Part 2 of the Tripos in pathology. And so I had a whole extra year of pathology, including microbiology. I would like to add something there. You're going to ask something else, but there's one very important part to this. The war was oppressive, but there were occasional bonuses. The bonus was that a certain gentleman in Germany called Adolf Hitler had caused so much trouble among Jewish scientists and physicians. Many of them had left Germany and come to Britain. And among our teachers in 1942, 3, 4 were very distinguished German physiologists, biologists, Blaschko, Nobel Prize winner, Jakobson, and others. And we were very fortunate indeed by being taught by some of these very distinguished European teachers. And that, more than that, compensated for the loss of younger British teachers, I think.
I'd like to explore that a little bit later, but I'd like to ask about your first years at Cambridge, because you did a BA, did you not?
Yes.
Now, did that cover subjects relating to your medical training as well? That came as part of the BA?
The BA, so-called Bachelor of Arts, which became a Master of Arts later,
yep.
The Bachelor of Arts covers the medical sciences. You know, it isn't just arts, it's a broad title for all such degrees. And so Part 1 of the Tripos, followed by Part 2, at the end of the 3rd year, I was able to graduate BA in that way, but it was part of what you would call preclinical training.
Yes, I wanted to clarify that because some years earlier at Edinburgh it was quite common for medical students to do 2 years of the arts course doing Latin, Greek, philosophy and so on before starting medicine, but that was not the case with your BA. That was part of your
It's an integral part of the preclinical career. Right. Now there is a very important corollary, if I may just add this, and that is that at that time Oxford and Cambridge did not yet offer a full medical course. In other words, in 1945, more or less as the war ended, I completed my 3 years as I've described, then, like all the others, had to leave Cambridge to go to take hospital training. The majority of my colleagues were going to London. They went to the Middlesex, Thomas's, Guy's, Bart's and so on. Only a small number went elsewhere, and I was one of the few. In Edinburgh, it's interesting that the late Sir James Fraser was doing the same thing in Oxford at the same time. You know, his father was, of course, Regius Professor of Surgery in Edinburgh, and he had to leave Oxford to go to whichever London hospital it was.
Now, could I ask you, are there any of the people who taught you or lectured to you at Cambridge that made any particular mark? You have mentioned the people who had come to Cambridge as refugees and so on.
Yes.
Were there any among them that you particularly remember or had any particular influence?
There are two kinds of influence, of course. There were one or two amusing episodes, if I might recount. one of our tutors was Professor William Boyd, whose normal home and academic home was, I think, Bath in London. But he'd been evacuated from London to Cambridge, and his tutorials were held in the Sidgwick Museum of Geology. And so we sat among these beautiful casts and ancient stones of geological ages, and learning about the anatomy of the pancreas and so on. There were other memorable episodes relating to individuals. On the positive side, one of the most striking characters was the former professor of physiology from Berlin, Feldberg, I think. I would have to check his spelling. And he was a masterly teacher, what you would call practical physiology. In other words, in front of quite a small group of students, he would dissect and display the pancreatic ducts in a dog and demonstrate actively how the secretions occurred. Perhaps the greatest example of that form of teaching, however, was the famous figure of Professor Adrian. Adrian and Sherrington had collaborated on studies of the spinal reflexes and were awarded a Nobel Prize. Adrian was only 31 when he was awarded a Nobel Prize, and we used to see Sherrington walking up and down the street. Adrian taught us, and if you can picture, we're talking about 64 years ago, Adrian would anesthetize a monkey, and in front of a class of 150 students, he would insert a probe, a microprobe, into one auditory nerve fiber of the monkey's ear, and display the responses to acoustic auditory stimuli by means of cathode ray oscilloscopes. So it was the most remarkable display of scientific skill combined with visual images. So Adrian was outstanding. He was a mountaineer in his spare time, and the story was that climbing in the Lake District, he fell one day and broke his wife's leg, but that's an incidental comment about his character.
We'd quite like to know when you began to think of pathology. I'm bringing it up now, wondering if perhaps the contact with Adrian and people at Cambridge, was Cambridge already sort of pointing you towards a scientific medical science rather than clinical practice? Or did that come later?
It started even before that, because my father was a friend of the clinical pathologist at the Sussex County Hospital, and when I became a student, he advised my father that I ought to have a microscope, and so he got one or two to show me. I was very young and naive, of course. I was 17 or so, and he offered me a second-hand Lights microscope or a new Beck, both costing £50, and I chose, rather foolishly, the Beck, which I've still got. And so that was even before I got to Cambridge.
Well, that was the interest that yes, as late as 84, you were writing about ultrasonic pathology.
Yes.
And also about microscopy at that time. So from childhood then, your interest in microscopy developed all that time and remained with you.
It was a continuing influence. Don't forget that if you're living in a house where your father is conducting a general practice, it wasn't a clinic. The patients came to his own house, and his consulting room had a little glass top bench at one end with a little spirit lamp for testing urines, and so one was accustomed to these things all the time.
I made a mistake. I didn't mean ultrasonic. I meant ultrastructure.
Yes, I know.
Yeah, right. Right, your career was shaping up that early,
Quite early.
even before you came to Edinburgh. Who were the people in Edinburgh as an undergrad, when you were an undergrad? Who were the teachers that impressed you at that time, in either direction?
Before, if I may, just before we go on to Edinburgh, if I could add one other very famous figure in Cambridge who influenced a whole generation, and that was Henry Roy Dean. He was Professor of Pathology in Sheffield, then in Manchester. During his Manchester time he perfected his work on anti-tetanus toxin immunization, which was brought in, of course, during the First World War. Then he held a chair of pathology in Cambridge, which incidentally had been held by an Edinburgh man when it was first established 125 years ago. C.S. Roy became the first Cambridge professor when he went back from Edinburgh. So Roy Dean, H.R. Dean, was very influential on a whole generation. For example, when he was in Sheffield, one of his young boys, as he used to call them, was a man called Flory. And he had very eminent people. So I just mentioned him. You asked about Edinburgh.
About the Edinburgh people.
Well, Edinburgh was strikingly different. The scene in Cambridge was one of vigorous contemporary competitive research. The scene in the Department of Pathology and Microbiology was dominated by people like Race and Sanger, who were describing for the first time the rhesus factor in blood. It was dominated by the first pictures of the electron microscopy of viruses. The whole scene was of people who weren't just teachers, they were internationally competitive research workers. In Edinburgh, this was entirely not so. And Edinburgh was, at that time, an excellent conventional educational school, but the scene in pathology, microbiology was traditional. In other words, the classes consisted not of experiments as we did in Cambridge, where the students actually would do these experiments, but in Edinburgh you sat in a very large classroom in Tediate Place with a row of pots and had to describe these, write them down, and these books were marked. When you went to a lecture, and you probably remember this, the attendance was recorded. In other words, attendance at a lecture in a medical school in Edinburgh was obligatory, and you handed in a printed card, and a uniformed servitor at the door collected these cards and ticked you off. At the end of a term, you got something called a DP, or duly performed certificate, without which you couldn't take the class examinations. Well, the intellectual scene was so different from Cambridge, where nobody cared a hoot whether you attended a lecture or not. If you didn't, you were regarded as rather silly, but if you did, you benefited from what I've described. So there was a great difference. On the other hand, the clinical teaching in Edinburgh, my first introduction to clinical teaching was superb, excellent. And I was very fortunate in entering the clinic of a man called Fergus Hewitt, he was president of this college at one point, and he was both a charming, old-fashioned physician, a kindly man, and a very, very good clinician. And it was due to his influence that I became a physician, because I went into medicine before I went into pathology. And it was due to his interest in chest diseases that I took the membership in respiratory diseases.
This is a choice that I want to come to a bit later, but there weren't any. How did you react to some of the people that you met as teachers? Like, you didn't do anatomy presumably in Edinburgh? You had passed that time.
I did. My long career in anatomy was in Cambridge, of course, yes. And there we did comparative anatomy as well as human anatomy. in Edinburgh we had to repeat, well, I had to repeat a year in pathology. I'd already done a year in Cambridge, but this was worthwhile because the styles were so different. The people, well, those who stand out, I suppose. Shall we take the negative side first?
Right.
There was a delightful, charming Edwardian figure who you will remember probably called Robertson Ogilvie. His distinction was that he and the photographer Tom Dodds produced the first British textbook illustrated with colour photography, 1940. His nature was so conventional that it was almost a caricature. He dressed formally, always in a dark pinstripe suit. He drove a black Austin Westminster car. He was an elder at one of the best-known West End churches, and his experimental work consisted of studies of diabetes in rabbits, but he never extended beyond one rabbit at a time. And so there was a ritual in which at 9:30 each morning he would arrive at the animal house, a syringe would be unpacked, and he would inject one rabbit with one injection of insulin or anti-insulin. Very conventional, very formal. His post-prandial, after-lunch introductions to his practical class were very similar in style to those of Alexander Monroe Tertius between 1820 and 1846. Alexander Monroe, as you remember, used to read out his grandfather's notes. And just like later, Robert Keller, the obstetrician, used to read out the notes in the textbook of his predecessor, Johnson, Ogilvie would read out his own book. And so at one, for example, he would be saying, around the arteriole are clusters of small lymphocytes. And one day a voice from the back of the class shouted out, "You've left out a line." And so this told you about this delightful, courteous, but old-fashioned and unimaginative teacher. He was accompanied by another teacher called Forbes, who worked in medical legal matters. By contrast, of course, were people like Stanley Davidson and particularly Learmonth, who I came to like very much. Sir James Learmonth was a very unusual surgeon who specialized in the autonomic nervous system, the control of bladder function and so on. He was a very misleading man because in front of classes he was shy and hesitant. He gave good lectures, but halfway through a lecture he would tend to stop and say to the class, "Now, boys and girls, you may blow your noses now and cough, and I'll resume when you've done that." And of course the class were not school children, and they resented being treated in this manner, but it's completely misleading. Outside the class, on a one-to-one basis, he was a most charming, delightful and helpful person, and of course a very good surgeon. He operated on the king, of course, and was very much respected. So he was eminent, as were so many others. Fergus Hewitt I mentioned, small, and there were occasional unusual ripples, shall we say, bearing in mind that the influence of the First World War was still very evident. Fergus Hewitt had served in the First World War, and many others had, and this still showed itself 25 years later. Dr. T.R.R. Todd, whose name, I don't know whether you've ever met him, he was very much affected by the First World War and was unpredictable in behaviour.
This was a behavioural thing. I was just wondering how this manifested itself. in these people?
It manifested itself in the case of Todd by unpredictable outbursts. For example, one day at the end of the ward, the nursing sister came in at the door and she was dressed for her half day off, and he shouted across all the patients some kind of abuse about the sister having no right to appear in the ward improperly dressed and so on. It was, but looking back on it, it was one of the delayed effects, I think, of the war. I don't know if he was a prisoner, but of course quite a number of them had been prisoners. And if I might interject something here, which you may be coming to, the influence of the Second World War. I've had the privilege or interesting experience of working with a number of people who were prisoners of war, the Japanese, in the Second World War. One of them, of course, was Woodruff. I worked very closely with Woodruff when he first came to Edinburgh. And when I worked in Belfast, I worked with Pantridge, who was a pioneer of coronary artery disease, and Lennox in Glasgow. Bernard Lennox, Pantridge and Woodruff were all Japanese prisoners of war, and they all still show the effects of this.
I would wonder if you would like to sort of speculate or tell me of your own thoughts on the matter of comparing your time at Edinburgh, that time at Edinburgh, what you might have done in London. I mean, did you have any thoughts at the time? Because you must have had colleagues who were people that you got to know at Cambridge had gone on to London teaching hospitals, perhaps comparing notes of did you think afterwards that coming to Edinburgh was a good thing, or would you have done just as well going to London teaching hospital?
Perhaps I can elaborate on this and explain a little more of the background, because if I can carry on with what happened to me. I graduated in the same class as John Richmond, 5th of July 1948, just at the moment that the health service was starting. And he went to the he went to a house job locally. I was fortunate. I was taken into a house job in the infirmary with Fergus Hewitt, and I did a second house job with Quarry Wood in surgery, so I was very lucky. But after that, there were interesting points which helped to answer your question. 1950, after I finished my house jobs, I was approaching the membership exam, and I wanted to get wider experience, so I took a one-year appointment in Lincolnshire in a county hospital, which the nearest consultant was 25 miles away in Lincoln. It was completely different from the teaching hospital. It was the kind of hospital where one saw and was responsible for everything. I even did the autopsies on some of my own cases, partly answering your question about pathology. We saw poliomyelitis and metastatic cancers and every form of disease. It was during that time, and this is answering your question, that I decided to have a look at the London College as well as the Edinburgh College of Physicians, and I entered for the Murchison Scholarship of the London College of Physicians. I was not successful, but it brought me into direct contact with Rosenheim, who was to become the president of the London College. And later, of course, in 1966, I moved to London, as I'll tell you in a moment. These episodes gave me a very good concept of what it would have been like to train in a London school. And I think there would have been some benefits, but overall, the picture I had of Edinburgh was very high quality, because the overall picture in Edinburgh was extremely good. I don't mean the basic sciences, which I'm a bit critical of, but I meant the clinical work.
And do you think then that in the Oxford-Cambridge system, the quality of the clinical teaching at these universities compensated for what was, I believe, a relative lack of scientific input at the clinical stages, of where the laboratory was not very highly regarded in many of the teaching hospitals by the clinical staff.
Yes, that's right, because it wasn't developed at that time. It's developed, of course, it's full, as Oxford has since.
Because what Horder, for example, very famously said here in Edinburgh at the Royal Medical Society, that the clinician did not need the sanction of the scientist, and he thought that you should beware physiology and so on. So there was a clear difference in that, but that presumably didn't matter very much if the grounding in the medical sciences had been excellent at the preliminary stages at Oxford and Cambridge.
Yes, I must say I didn't recognise any disadvantage of that kind, because having worked almost cheek by jowl with European scientists of the highest order, that was no disadvantage in coming into what was a very good clinical scene. The two were complementary, I would have said. I had something to slip in, if I might, if you would allow me to. You were asking about Edinburgh teachers, and I told you how my high regard for Sir James Learmonth and Stanley Davison, of course, but in the background was the Professor of Pathology, Murray Drennan, who incidentally had been in Belfast, as I was later. Murray Drennan was a delightful, charming man who courteous and friendly, but he was the most boring speaker. The students, in all their numbers, would enter the lecture theatre. The great man would speak and then call for a lantern slide. The lights were dimmed, and at once there was a noise like rushing water or thunder, and when the lights went on again, the 180 student class had suddenly reduced itself to about 33. He never said anything, he never complained, he never said anything about it. He carried on as though it was perfectly normal.
And was Derek Dunlop one of your?
Derek Dunlop, I wasn't in his clinic in the infirmary, but I have a very clear recollection of one day I was preparing for the membership, and he was teaching me individually the use of the ophthalmoscope, and he was a most excellent teacher. Of course, I knew him as a lecturer and enjoyed his humour, and in fact, I met him in London later on. But we all had a high regard for him as a lecturer.
Could you tell me about, after qualifying, about your house jobs then? One of the things that people might be interested in is how did you come to be appointed to these house jobs? Because of course the method is now radically different, but how was it accomplished in your time?
In the case of my house physician's appointment with Dr. Fergus Hewitt, I think, looking back, it was fortuitous. We had a third-year class, in other words, the first clinical year. I had come back from Cambridge, and he was teaching the class beside the beds in the ward. And I have a clear recollection that he asked this group of 20 or 22 students what was bronchiectasis. And I was the only person who knew, because I happened to have seen this condition in Cambridge. And I'm quite sure this sort of, it wasn't long after that, when I was still in my third year, that he said, "Will you be my house physician?" So we got on very well, and he was a very good teacher. Later on, 6 months later, having lived in infirmary, of course, as we all did for that time, I was passed over by him to Mr. Quarry Wood, who was at that time the president of the College of Surgeons. He was quite different. He was a delightful, charming, courteous man, very quiet, very retiring. And one of our jobs, of course, was to accompany him to his car each day when he left and open the door and make sure the great man left happily. One day, he was a very hard worker, as they all were. He would operate in his nursing homes before coming to infirmary. And one day, midday, 1 o'clock, 1:30, he collapsed and had to be taken out of the theatre because he was physically exhausted and the strain was too great. But he was a lovely person. When he retired, all his former house surgeons and clinical tutors contributed to a silver plate of this sort of size with a picture of Quarry Wood in the centre, standing in the River Tweed fishing. The reason it was chosen was that he was such a keen salmon fisher that he stopped his car one day when driving to the Peel or some other hospital, leapt into the river to fish, but forgot to take off his bowler hat. And this is shown.
Could we go on to talk about the shaping of your career, as it were? And you had the idea that you were going into scientific development, the clinical set, quite early on. And yet, we see from your qualifications that you then did the membership and so on. So that leads me to ask you, did you set out with a plan, with a strategy, or did you go from one opportunity to another, as it were? Did you have a straightforward, complete strategy of how you were going to do this from the beginning?
I had a plan in the sense that after finishing my house jobs that I've mentioned, I took a year's position in a very modest little hospital in Lincolnshire, which offered huge experience and a time to study. And I took the membership examination at the first opportunity and was very lucky to pass. In other words, 1950, only 2 years after graduating. Then we were called to the army, but because I had the membership, first of all, my recruitment was delayed by a year, but when it came, I was given the status of junior medical specialist, and that is another story. We talked to the commanding officer at the training depot, and he said, "Where would you like to go?" And of course the Korean War was on at that time. And I said, "Well, my wife is expecting our first child," as I'd married in 1949, and I wouldn't be quite nice to be reasonably near home. Home included Germany, and so within a few weeks I found myself on the train heading for Hamburg, and there followed 2 years in which my medical responsibility, my practice, extended from the Danish border in the north to Bremen in the south. And my daughter and my elder son were born in Germany. But that is another story.
And you were based in Hamburg?
I was based in Hamburg, interrupted by 4 months in Oldenburg. So we got to know some very interesting parts of the country. The golf course in Hamburg, incidentally, was designed by an Englishman. But Hamburg as a city is of the greatest interest because in 1950 the streets were still not rebuilt, and one could drive from the British Military Hospital, which was 5 miles from the centre. It was a huge, the size of the infirmary. Drive from there to the centre, and one would pass 5 miles of complete devastation. They 6-story Edwardian buildings reduced to rubble, square miles of nothing. So one had many stories. I don't know whether you wish any of these, but one of the medical orderlies in the military hospital, many of them of course were German, and one was named Siegfried, and one of his jobs had been helping the military running the brothel in the basement. On other occasions, the officers' mess of the main command was approached by a German truck one day which arrived to collect the carpets for cleaning. So all the carpets were taken from the officers' mess, but they never returned. On another day, one night, large numbers of Polish and other immigrants arrived at the hospital and stripped as many as possible of the hospital roofs of all the lead. And so there were all kinds of strange occurrences. But the medical experience was very important and remarkable. I haven't quite answered your question because all this is part of what I would call my intention to be a physician. Because you can see I was working as a physician, looking after medical patients, incidentally examining officers up to the rank of colonel for their annual medical approval. The medical cases included the wives and families not only of the army, who on the whole were very fit, but of the consulates and other associated organizations. And so I had the responsibility of caring for the son of the French consul who had rheumatic fever, and on another occasion I looked after the daughter of a major who was about to come to Hamburg from Bremen, and his daughter, aged 19 or so, was taken acutely ill with what turned out to be meningococcal meningitis. She was brought up to the main hospital in Hamburg, and about 24 hours later we found it. I diagnosed meningococcal meningitis with incipient adrenal failure, but we saved her life. And 24 hours later, Brigadier Bennett, the British Army of the Rhine senior physician, came in accompanied by a senior consultant from Great Ormond Street, MacDonald Crouchley, who you probably recall. And I was put through my paces. It's rather like sitting in membership again, but you don't forget these experiences. So after 2 years in the army, I returned to, this is a crucial point and the answer to your question, what decides what? Philosophically, I believe that not fate, but chance plays a large part in our affairs. I intended to be a physician. I had the opportunity of a senior house officer appointment at Hammersmith in cardiology, but at that very moment, the possibility of a position as a junior assistant clinical pathologist at Edinburgh's Hospital, Cambridge, came up. It was a choice of one or the other. And I argued that 2 years of clinical pathology would be good training for medicine. But chance entered the game, and after that 2 years of very good training, I had the opportunity of returning to Edinburgh in a research fellowship. And that research fellowship was in rheumatology and involved pathology, not medicine. So these are the way in which chance episodes occur.
Yes. But you came back and sat your London membership later, didn't you?
No, I didn't sit that exam. That was awarded
That was right.
ad hominem, or whatever they call it. That was much later.
I had to clear that up because it did look a little odd.
It's quite honest, but I didn't sit the exam.
Yes. Right. So back in Edinburgh, what was the scene like at your research fellowship in Edinburgh at that time?
May I interject one more word about the army?
Yes, right.
The army gave the opportunity of travelling on the weekly train which went from Hamburg through Munich to Austria to collect those injured in skiing accidents. There were so many accidents that a train went each week to bring them back. I had that experience, and also on vacation had the opportunity, having bought a Volkswagen car, of travelling through over the Brenner Pass to North Italy and to places like Pisa and Florence and so on. So there was a lot of travelling. But that's back to Edinburgh. That was a dramatic change again, because the research fellowship, the rheumatic diseases unit at the Northern General Hospital, had just been established by the Nuffield Foundation. It was part of Stanley Davison's broader approach to extending Edinburgh's academic activities. And the man in charge was the late J.J.R. Duthie, later to be Professor Duthie. Did you know him at all?
No, I know of.
He was a man of character. For example, when ibuprofen was introduced first, a large meeting was held at Heathrow Airport, attended by people from all over the world. And at one point, Professor Duthie, by that time well known in the field, was asked for his opinion. And he stood up and said, "You're better sticking to aspirin. Brufen's no bloody good." And he said this in front of an audience of some hundreds of international. He was very direct. His approach to patients was equally direct. And the patient entering his clinic with an osteoarthritic knee might expect to be advised to take it easy. But Duthie would say, "Your knee's shot to pieces." This is how he spoke. We used to argue every lunchtime about research projects. He was very, very aware of the need to find the cause of rheumatoid arthritis, to treat it properly. He was not only a good clinician, but he was a very determined research worker. And his projects were the anemia of rheumatoid arthritis, the causes of rheumatoid. One of his experiments, which only partly reached the light of day, was injecting himself and any volunteers, including patients, with synovial fluid from the knee joints of patients with rheumatoid arthritis. It was a study which came to a premature end when one of the patients who volunteered to be injected developed life-threatening hepatitis, viral hepatitis, because he managed to transmit viral hepatitis accidentally. Mm-hmm. But he was that kind of person. And his work on rheumatoid anemia was of very high quality. John Richmond, incidentally, was my collaborator.
And you did the PhD before you did an MD, I think.
Yes, at that time I thought it was time to do something else. So I had, in other moments, I had collaborated with the biochemist there in the study of experimental arthritis. And the experimental arthritis became a PhD, that's right.
Tell me about experimental arthritis.
Well, there are 1,500 ways of producing experimental arthritis, or many. You can clearly damage the joint. And one serious study at that time, whether it's in Paris, I don't remember, but this particular investigator produced arthritis by taking, shall we say, 100 rats, holding them at a height of 6 feet and dropping them to the ground 16 times a day, and they got inflamed joints. We used synovial fluid, we used polysaccharides, and a very interesting study came from a polysaccharide called carrageenan. Carrageenan is extracted from seaweed, and the polysaccharide is an inflammatory substance. it led, incidentally, to some work on cigarette smoking, but that's incidental. I found that if you injected carrageenan into the peritoneal cavity, you produced inflammation, and we could cultivate macrophages. In order to study the details, it was convenient to make a tube of this polysaccharide, rather like agar. It's set as a gel. Some people used glass tubes and just expelled this little cylinder into the cavity. I hadn't got any glass tubes at the time, so I used cigarette paper in the form of cigarette tubes. Turned out, incidentally, that cigarette paper is one of the most inflammatory substances that one ever comes across. I tried to convey this to the British Tobacco Association to get support for further research, but they didn't reply. But that's incidental. Inflammatory arthritis, that led, am I saying too much? That led to an entirely unexpected development. It was at that time that an American report came out on the antihypertensive drug hydralazine. They found in Baltimore or somewhere that hydralazine given to patients with hypertension might occasionally produce a syndrome rather like systemic lupus. So with the assistance of Sir James Learmonth, I started a dog study to test the effects of hydralazine in the hope that I could produce lupus experimentally. Wasn't very effective, and so I turned to the need to make animals hypertensive in order to test the antihypertensive drug. And I did this because dogs were expensive, and I turned to the rat. And for the next several years, spent a great deal of time producing hypertension in rats, treating them not only with hydralazine but with other antihypertensives. And out of that came 36 papers on hypertension. And the most important observation was the fact that, and this is really still, I think, quite important, in order to prevent, first of all, in order to produce the lesions in arterioles, which are characteristics of malignant hypertension, raised blood pressure by itself is not enough. I went, the following year, 1958, I went to Cleveland, Ohio, and worked for a year on this kind of topic. And there was wonderfully good experimental facilities. And you can actually apply blood pressures of 1,000 or more millimeters of mercury directly into the small arteries, arterioles of the rat without causing any damage at all. Very, very high blood pressure does not damage a normal vessel. And so from this emerged the concept, which I still am interested in, that a condition like accelerated malignant hypertension is something that results when vessels are predisposed to injury by something else. And that led to a huge amount of work on the metabolism of the smooth muscle cells of arterioles. And so in order to get that sort of severe disease, something has to upset the vessels first. The other side of the story was that you can prevent these lesions without controlling blood pressure. In other words, there are two sides of the coin which I still think remain to be explored. I mean, there's quite a lot to which people like Dr. Boone, I think, would be interested in. But that got cut in for various reasons. That work was interrupted by yet another element of chance. Because, may I continue? One day I had formed a friendship with a man called Ted Gilman, who was Professor of Physiology in Natal, South Africa. He had been forced by the South African government to leave the country, or he felt he should leave because they were interfering with his teaching of coloured students, to whom he was very sensitive. He came to this country, settled at the Agricultural Research Council laboratories in Babraham near Cambridge, and I met him and we travelled to the Pathological Society in Aberdeen together. So we got to know each other. A year or two later, I was visiting him in Babraham. I forget the reason why. I was sitting in his room like this. He left the room for a few minutes, and I was thumbing through the pages of the British Medical Journal, and I came across an advertisement. Wanted, Director for New Research Institute, Rheumatology, etc., etc. At any rate, this is the way in which I came across what came to be called the Kennedy Institute of Rheumatology, for which I applied and was duly appointed and started on the 1st of June 1966. But it's a very good example of how chance can is completely fortuitous. And that takes me into another story entirely.
Could you just tidy up the chronology of that? Then you went from your house jobs and then to the army and then to the clinical pathology.
Yes, house jobs, then a year in Lincolnshire, and then having taken a membership 1950 into the army.
Yeah.
Back from the army to Cambridge for 2 years in clinical pathology, and then a research position in Edinburgh.
And was that a time-limited thing in it, the research fellowship?
Sorry?
Was that a time-limited fellowship in Edinburgh?
It was a 2-year fellowship.
2 years,
yes. But it was at that time, we're talking about 1956 or so, that I was appointed to a lectureship.
Right.
And only 2 years after that, I went to the United States for a year.
Yeah. And then
back into Edinburgh. And a few years passed before I met Ted Gilman. It was 1966, in fact, when I went to London.
And how does Belfast fit in?
Let me tell you, would you like me to go straight to Belfast?
No, whatever path you like.
Well, Terence Kennedy had been a ballet dancer, and the best way of American origin. He lived with a male friend in a large house in Regent's Park. At some point, he had travelled on a holiday cruise to the West Indies, and on the cruise he met a good lady called Matilda Marks, who happened to be one of the daughters of the late Michael Marks, who had founded Marks and Spencer. She was a woman of great wealth, but not very fit. She was not only very overweight, but she also had osteoarthritis. As time passed, they married, and Matilda, the kindly person, said to her practitioner, "What can I do to repay the medical profession for the care they've given me?" He said, "You can make an endowment to a London hospital to set up laboratories and research on the subject." She offered £500,000 to St Thomas's Hospital, where he couldn't find a space, and so the offer was transferred, as it were, to Charing Cross Hospital. And then, in the course of time, a committee was set up under the Arthritis and Rheumatism Council, under the late Dr. W.S.C. Copeman, and this in turn led to a building being planned, and then the need for staff. And that led to an advertisement for a position, and on June the 1st, 1966, I found myself sitting by myself in this building. There were not yet any windows or telephones or any services. It was just a bare structure, but it had started. And within 2 to 3 years, we had a staff of over 100 and had published 100 papers. So it was very active, very exciting. Among the staff, of course, were large numbers of people from other countries, Mexico, Czechoslovakia, Australia, and so on. And that is a whole story. It led into extremely interesting paths, not only in experimental work, but in medical politics, because of course I became drawn into the committees of the Arthritis Rheumatism Council and the MRC. I was on the Physiological Systems Committee of the MRC and also the ARC. Then, chance occurred. There were difficulties with money, and if you have a young family, by 1971 we had 4 children, and 3 of them were undergoing very expensive education at St Paul's Girls' and Boys' School, London, and I hadn't received, in other words, my salary was still that of a basic consultant health service with no London allowance or anything. And that, together with other factors, made me feel that it was time to return to a more conventional academic position. And so I looked at the chair of pathology in Sheffield, and by that time I'd also looked at Kingston, Ontario, New York, and so on. But eventually I came up with the interesting idea of crossing the water to the Queen's University of Belfast. 2 principles there. The first is that the holder of the chair, Sir John Henry Bigot, was one of the best-known figures in the world of pathology. He was an Edinburgh person, he'd been there a very long time and was retiring. Second was that the Queen's University of Belfast Medical School is the 6th largest school in this country. So it was a very big place and it was extremely well supported. And so we crossed the water, and that led into another world in which stepping over the rifles of the army in the morning on the way to work became part of life. One of my responsibilities, of course, was caring for the mortuary at the Royal Victoria Hospital. And if I tell you, which you will know already, that on occasional evenings the IRA would fire rockets against the Children's Hospital wall, and the son of an ophthalmologist was abducted at knife point one morning, and so on and so on. These stories are so well known. But it was a very interesting time and very dramatic time, because we were lucky to live outside Belfast in the most beautiful part of the country called Helen's Bay, which is very, very similar in appearance and style to East Lothian. It's the same kind of country, lovely beaches, beautiful open spaces, and very accessible. So we combined this sort of beautiful background living with the most unusual social picture in the city, together with contemporary scientific research. If I add one anecdote about the research, it will give you some idea. My opposite number in the Department of Mechanical Engineering was one of the advisors to the Dounreay Atomic Power Station. I'm trying to remember his name, Cleland, I think. At any rate, he and I met one day at the Belfast airport. And I said, "Where are you off to?" And he said, "I'm going up to Dounreay to weld a crack in an atomic reactor." And I said, "How are you going to do that?" He said, "Well, as a matter of fact," he reached inside his pocket, took out his wallet. He said, "I've got the explosive here." And he brought out a piece of material the size of a postage stamp. He said, "That is sufficient explosive to weld a crack in an atomic reactor." So he was an interesting person. So Belfast is a place of paradoxes, you know, because the population overall is very stable, hard-working, conscientious. The standard technical skill is very high. They're good people, given half a chance. It's very good. And the work in microscopy and television studies and so on is of the highest quality. We set up the first teaching program in live television in mortuaries in this country. We demonstrated this to the Pathological Society. The problem was that each day in Belfast, the students would be encouraged to come at lunchtime to see a little demonstration of what we would call morbid anatomy. And on average, 5 or 6 of them would come because it was their lunch hour. So I suggested that we test the effects of television. And for about £200, we borrowed some black and white material, camera, a couple of monitors. And within a very short time, the 5 or 6 students had become 90 or 100. For a little extra money, we got colour television. We recorded this, we presented it to the Pathological Society. And television teaching, of course, it's so routine now, but at that time it was a novelty. So Belfast had its extraordinary contrast between the wonderfully exciting and the beautiful and the horrible. A pile of, after a bomb explosion, when there are the pieces of some, shall we say, 40 or 50 individuals lying in a heap at the end of the mortuary is not really very attractive. And to see a young woman lying on a mortuary table with a single .2 rifle bullet wound of the right side of the skull, shot by mistake by the army. These are very strange circumstances. It was at that time, of course, that my elder son had entered medical school in Birmingham, and my daughter had become a trainee nurse in Edinburgh. And so only 2 of our family were at school in Belfast. The elder boy, who sadly died some years later, was at Campbell College, and he was very interesting because he was a musician who played the drums and got to know some of the Irish people very well. His comments on Irish schools were interesting because every discussion in a class about, shall we say, Caesar's accounts of wars in Gaul always turned into a discussion on Irish politics. Now, I've gone a long way from what you asked.
So how long did you spend in Northern Ireland?
It was about 5.5 years. What happened then was that we enjoyed many parts of it. It was fascinating, as you can tell. We used to go to the restaurant where well-known politicians went. The response of other people to the scene was very interesting. Our family would come across from England or Scotland, but it was very difficult to persuade Professor Alistair Curry from Edinburgh yes, he was in Edinburgh by that time, and he was my external examiner. But every time there was an examination, Alistair Curry would either have flu or a cold or gout or something. But I solved that problem by replacing him with a delightful man, Donald Heath from Liverpool. He was exactly the opposite. Alistair Curry obviously hated the idea of coming to Ulster. Donald Heath in Liverpool was fascinated with politicians. He was keen to come and meet everybody and get into the scene and learn about it. And we got on famously. I used to examine in Liverpool and he examined Belfast.
I can understand both points of view. I used to go to Queen's regularly and just to stay at the Europa until somebody blew it up.
Yes.
But the contrast, as you say, between the beautiful and peaceful parts of Belfast and the awful centre is almost beyond belief.
You know about golf in Belfast, don't you? There was an occasion, it was a very nice consultant called Craig, I think, who was the captain or vice captain of one of the better known clubs down the coast. And he said, "You must come and have a game." And so he said, come to my house for coffee at 11 o'clock on Saturday. So this game of golf, I left my home about 10:30, and I got home from this game of golf at 10 o'clock in the evening, because coffee at his home, followed by a long drive, followed by lunch at the golf club, followed by the game, followed by an evening meal. And so our game of golf was about 12 hours. But that's...
So what determined the next move then from...
Well, I decided that I was getting too old for this kind of thing. And seriously speaking, it was largely a question of simply wanting to return to one of the mainland schools. I did think of Leeds or Sheffield, but then what happened was that a new chair was created in Manchester, and I applied for that. And that was very important in many ways, because the population of Greater Manchester is about the same as that of the whole of Scotland. It's a very, very busy, active area. And for example, the Christie Hospital in Manchester has at any one time under treatment about 200 primary pituitary tumours. It's an enormous structure, and the experience is huge. It just happened that at the time I was there, they had already appointed a new professor of immunology in the shape of the late Professor W.E. Ford. And Bill Ford came from Aberdeen. He'd worked in Oxford, and he was a European figure. Harold Fox was a professor of gynecological pathology, and it was a very, very strong structure. Bill Ford went to Australia in 1984, I think it was, and was killed in a car accident. Not the first British person that's suffered that fate. Driving in Australia, of course, is very dangerous. But Manchester offered the possibility of constructing what was almost a new medical school, because do you know the story of Manchester medically?
A little bit about it.
I mean, broadly speaking, what happened was that in return, it was a bargain in which the government agreed to build a new medical school building, which became the Stopford building, the largest UGC building ever built. In return for which Manchester would take the clinical output from Dundee, which didn't have a St Andrews, which didn't have a clinical school. And the result was a very large class. When I say very large, 270, something like that. Problem was that, of course, they had to have hospital beds, they had to have the staff. And so by the time I went there were 3 professors of medicine, 3 professors of surgery, 3 teaching hospitals. And the one I was involved with was South Manchester, where my job was to create what was effectively a new department.
But the students are so well scattered in that population, weren't they?
Yes, yes.
But the clinical classes, I believe, weren't, in fact, any bigger than Edinburgh or Glasgow, because there were so many places for them to get clinical experience in that great conurbation. Isn't that how it worked?
Yes, the distance was a problem, because you had to, the students had to travel. In the central medical school, Oxford Road, is near the main university buildings, and it's a huge structure, rather like the Pentagon, and it's next to the Manchester Royal Infirmary. But the other 2 hospitals, one is at Hope Hospital, is about 3-4 miles north, the other's 3-4 miles south, and the students had to go. And incidentally, for committee work and meetings, you always had to allow the time necessary to get backwards and forwards. But these are small inconveniences, really.
But I think it was generally agreed that the experiment was a success, wasn't it?
Oh yes, yes.
That there's connection between St Andrews and Manchester.
Yes, that worked out, to my knowledge, very well. On what I saw of it over quite a long period, yes, it developed very well. Mind you, some of my colleagues were not such enthusiastic teachers. I like teaching classes, and one of my colleagues, John Ball, said, those students going down the corridors of the Stopford building, they're like a herd of sheep. They don't know where they're going, they don't know who's leading them or why. And so he was very dismissive, but he was a shy man. He didn't like teaching.
But, I mean, you've spent quite an effort in teaching, because apart from your research papers, you've actually produced a number of books that are part of the teaching library, are they not?
Yes, that particular part of our work started in Edinburgh, of course, when in pathological histology it was a chance meeting with the photographer who I've already mentioned, T.C. Dodds, which allowed that to take place because he was a world-famous photographer. And that was the first effort, and then of course it was quite instinctive to put together the work on rheumatology, experimental arthritis, and so on, and that became a book on what we call connective tissue diseases. And so one thing tends to lead to another, doesn't it?
So you had a big teaching commitment then in Manchester, but there was still a research component in there too, I take it.
There was a very large research component because the Arthritis Rheumatism Council, as it was called then, the ARC, gave us a lot of support. And that led, if I may continue for, that led to a very interesting further association. I became interested in London when I was at the Kennedy Institute. I was interested in the surface of joints. And when you look at the surface of an exposed knee joint, the cartilage, in fact, is not normally smooth. It is covered by a series of little undulations. You can see them with a light microscope. You can see them even better with an interference microscope. But then on the scene came something called a scanning electron microscope, which allows you to look at surfaces. The problem with a scanning electron microscope is that the tissue has to be dried and prepared, by and large. But then a further development, which emerged from various contacts, was low temperature electron microscopy. And the centre for this that we became associated with was in Lancaster, about 50 miles north of Manchester. And so I used to shuttle up and down the road from Manchester to Lancaster to work with my good friend Dr. Oates in low temperature scanning electron microscopy and low temperature electron probe X-ray microanalysis. And if you'd allow me to interject another little story. When I was still in London, I came across a paper in Nature by a man called Hall. Turned out to be Ted Hall. He was an American physicist of very high caliber working at the Cavendish laboratory, and he was using an instrument to study the X-ray emissions from preparations that were irradiated with electron beam. And by collecting the X-rays, you could tell what elements were present. And so it suited me very well because we could tell where was the calcium, where was the phosphorus, and how much there was. You could measure it. And I was doing this work for a number of months, up and down with him. The years went by, and about 1995, a few years ago now, an American writer in the Washington Post, followed by a book, told the world that this man that I had been working with in 1971 had been the agent who had released the atomic bomb details to the Russians in 1940-something while working at the Atomic Research Station, Los Alamos. The story there, this is one of my more interesting stories, I think. The story was that young Ted Hall, whose father was an immigrant Russian, was an idealist. He was a brilliant mathematician and graduated top of the class from Harvard at the age of 18 and was taken straight into the Manhattan Project, working at Los Alamos, he felt that each country in the world should have equal access to knowledge of atomic structure, and he passed information to Russian agents. Now, this was not known for, well, it was first released publicly about 1995, and I realized, to my astonishment, that I had enjoyed working with this agent. He was a delightful, cultivated, civilized, well-spoken man of the highest scientific quality. And since then, I happen to have met Professor Andrews, who is the British authority on the KGB. I don't know if you know the name, but he appears occasionally on radio, television. And he is the man who was responsible for analyzing the KGB records which were extracted from Russia towards the end of the Cold War. You know, when the Iron Curtain came down, there was a huge operation getting KGB records out of Russia. And Andrews, now I've met Andrews and I've talked to him about this man Hall, and I've sent him, we published a paper together, so I've sent him a copy of the paper that I wrote with this Russian spy. But that's incidental.
Now this is going off at a tangent at this point, but I think your career, you've been very much involved in research for many years and in teaching for many years.
Yes.
I'd just like to ask you if you've got any general comments that you could make simply about the situation about research in this country and the funding and difficulties over the period while you've been engaged in research. I mean, have you found funding in this country difficult or easy to get support, or just as a general reaction to the looking back on your research career, perhaps comparing it with the States or other places?
Yes, I will certainly answer that. At some point on the recording, I'd like to say a word, because by this time you and Mr. Chapman will be wondering what happened to my wife and family. I would like to say a word at some point, in fairness. It's never easy, but unfortunately, two factors at least play a large part. If I take one example, it's what we call flavor of the month. If you are investigating, well, shall we take the field that I know something about, rheumatology. If you take the field of bone and joint disease, I haven't seen a paper on the cause of rheumatoid arthritis for several years. There are large numbers of papers, almost once by month, about the treatment of rheumatoid arthritis, about the genetic predisposition to rheumatoid arthritis, but the fact that 1% of the population of this and other countries has rheumatoid arthritis, it's a hugely common problem, causing not only disability but also occasional suicide and all kinds of very common problem, but the money for investigating it is not being directed to the cause. In other words, you or your family may inherit the HLR genes which predispose to rheumatoid, but there still has to be an operative cause. Why? And of course the answer is money is not available. The money will go into the genetic, the heritable background, the genetic predisposition, the analysis of genes and their frequency, studies of conjoined twins and so on. But the number of people who are actually studying what at one time was, say, the microbiology of rheumatoid arthritis it's very, very small. This is because I think you probably agree with this, the drug companies are very influential in funding research projects. And if I want money, if you are the dean of the medical school and you want money for your new department of, say, genetic studies or medicine or whatever, the way to get it is to take something that people are interested in financially. And the drug companies are not going to make any money from you finding the cause of rheumatoid arthritis. They are making their money from the treatment and the effective treatment. And so the way to get money is to decide to do work, as Professor Maney and others have done in London, on the use of anti-lymphocyte serum and antibodies and so on in the treatment of this disease. Well, that's one factor. This is what I call flavour of the month, very much influenced by big business and pharmaceutical company finance. There is a factor of who you know and where you are. In other words, it's a very simple rule of life. Be very careful where you work and who you work with. And if you choose to work with a Nobel Prize winning geneticist, you're more likely to get the Nobel Prize yourself than if you work at, shall we say, the Musselburgh Research Station by yourself. There are other factors, but the fact of being in the right place at the right time, and so that, of course, is a very long-term plan, but many of us are not able to live a life like that. You know, I could never say to myself, no, I'm going to spend the next 25 years in, shall we say, we'll take one example, Aberdeen, working on scanning techniques, because I know that that's the place I'm most likely to get my Nobel Prize in the year 2045. We don't work like that. And so, apart from chance, I think, I'm sure you'd agree that the financial background is very important, and the choice of where you are.
We're getting towards the end of our time. Could I ask you one simple question? If you were starting again, would you have a medical career once again? Would you do the same thing again?
Those are actually two questions.
Right.
Would I do the same thing again? That's difficult, but yes, I'm very happy. I think if you're pinning me down, because I think one of your functions is to sort of, if you're pushing me, I am an idealist in the sense that I know this is exaggerating. I think doctors at root are analogous with medieval monks. In other words, I think the doctor should be prepared to treat the sick for nothing. I believe that there should be a free health service, free as far as it's possible, and I think doctors should, I know it's an idealistic concept, but I think it's a calling as much as an occupation.
So from that, could I then go to the next generation? Your family have by and large followed you, haven't they, into medicine?
Yes, they've been very tolerant. My wife is in the nursing profession, and her daughter is trained as a nurse, and incidentally, our daughter is married to a neurologist, so there's a very large medical. But they have followed. Of course, with children it's different because they don't have very much choice. But we've been very fortunate in most ways, although, as I just mentioned in passing, one of our sons died at an early age, having trained as a lawyer. But that's, we are, in the medical profession, you're only too well aware that these sorts of episodes can happen to anyone, anywhere. But yes, I've been loyally supported, and it's very important to record that, because It is not possible to follow this sort of profession without, it's very demanding, isn't it? Demanding of time and the idea of having Saturday morning off or something like that. I should say, if I might just add this, it was a tradition in the sense that in the olden days, general practitioners would work like that too. My father had a surgery in his own house every evening, including Saturday, from 6 o'clock onwards. Every patient who came each day was seen. Sunday morning he spent visiting his patients on rounds, so the only time he had off during the week was a Sunday afternoon. And that was regarded as a normal practice. It's very different, isn't it?
Thank you very much. I think we've got to stop at that point.